1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I came to you in weakness, with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. When we read this, we have to understand that we're in the middle of Paul's case that he's making. And that becomes immediately evident as we look at just this opening phrase. It's clear that we're in the middle of a discussion. Paul says, and so it was with me. He's referring back to chapter 1. And in chapter 1, Paul makes the case that the gospel is foolishness to the world, and that God loves to make the wise people of this world foolish by revealing the gospel to those who are the least in our society. God reveals himself to the people who are not wise, who are not intelligent, who are not powerful. And when he does that, he shows himself to be powerful. And Paul is now applying that principle here to himself. He says, and so it was with me. He's saying, I too am the weak and the feeble of this world. I'm not strong. He says, that's how the gospel came to you guys. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. What we discover is that Paul, in this whole paragraph, is going to unpack this phrase right here. When I came to you. He's really going to tell us the manner in which he came. So beginning right here with I did not come, all the way down to verse 3, he says, I came to you in. So he gives us what he did not do. And then in verse 3, he gives us what he did do. And that gets all the way down to the end of verse 4. And then at the end, he tells us why, with this important connective word, so that. So he says, the same way that God saves the weak for his glory to shame the strong, that is how the gospel was preached to you when I came. And then that when I came gets unpacked in verses 1 through 4. He's going to tell us how he came. And in verse 5, he gives us the reason. So that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power, which is exactly what the gospel does, right? It's not something that humans can get on their own wisdom. It's the power of God. So we see how it functions in the whole argument. But for now, then, let's unpack the way that Paul came to them. He says first, I did not come. So first we get the negative example. This is what Paul did not do. I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom. And remember that's Paul has already made mention of both of those things in the previous verses. So when Paul preaches, he does not preach eloquence. He preaches simplicity. Nor does he preach human wisdom, the wisdom of the Greeks. Neither of these two things are in his message. He says, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. And what's the testimony about God? It's the gospel, right? It's the message of the cross. It's the message of Jesus. So Paul does not come with eloquence or human wisdom as he proclaims to you the testimony about God. Why? For. He gives us a reason for this first verse. For I resolved. And this is important because this denotes that Paul made a choice. This denotes that Paul made a choice. He says, for I resolved. He chose in his mind to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This is the only thing Paul wants to know, right? It is similarly here, it's connected to that testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Paul does not want to get beyond the simple message of the gospel. And as we go into chapter 3, we'll see why they're not ready really for any doctrine besides this elementary introductory doctrine to Christianity. But this is also, it's something that we never outgrow as Christians. We always need to keep this central to our worldview, central to our understanding. So Paul says, I resolve to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Not eloquence, not human wisdom, just Christ and him crucified, just the message of the gospel. What was before previously foolishness, remember that? And a stumbling block, Paul lives there. He never goes beyond it. He never apologizes for Christianity being foolishness or a stumbling block. He stays right here. So that was the negative. Right here, beginning in verse 1 all the way down to here in the verse 2, that was the negative. And then beginning in verse 3, Paul begins the positive. He says, I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. Right? So it's the exact reversal. I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, which we would normally consider good. And then here in the positive, he says, but I did come in weakness and with great fear and trembling, which are the very things that we would say, well, that would be bad. And yet Paul puts it in the positive here. I came to you in weakness with great fear and with trembling. And just remember here that this is all Acts 16 through 18. And you can remember why. Not only does Paul not want to come with eloquence or human wisdom, Paul also has had a very hard time getting the gospel out. It has resulted in his removal of several cities. And so he's truly afraid as the riots begin to grow in Corinth. It says, I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. And we would normally think bad things of that, but he continues. He says, he just keeps pouring it on. My message in my preaching, which, wait, Paul, isn't this about Jesus? And yes, Paul's message and Paul's preaching is synonymous with Christ and him crucified. Paul's got nothing else to talk about. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words. And now we kind of understand a little bit more of why eloquence and wisdom is important. People would use these to be persuasive. I want you to agree with me. I want you to think I'm right. And Paul is not concerned with anybody agreeing with him. Paul does not need any Corinthian person to believe that he's right. He has no need to persuade anybody. Instead, this is what he relies on. But. So not persuasion, but what? So Paul, if you're not going to use persuasion to get people to believe in Jesus, what will be used? But with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. Demonstration. What does this mean? Demonstration of the Spirit's power. Well, if we were purely going to go on the context of what we're looking at, let me approach that a different way. Could there be some specific incredible act of the Spirit? Is it a miracle maybe that Paul performed among the Corinthians? Well, we know that this happened a lot, so it's possible. This is definitely possible, but it also may not be the case. Acts 16 through 18, and particularly Acts 18 for the story of the city of Corinth, we don't really see any miracles, at least that Luke decides to record. So we could say that maybe the demonstration of the Spirit's power here is not so much miracles in the terms of signs and wonders, but just simply belief. This may be more what he's getting at, that the demonstration of the Spirit's power is when a man who is weak and afraid and trembling, and we could add to that looks poor and ragged. Ragged. And is outwardly, this is what we see in the next one, that Paul is outwardly wasting away. That this man who is poor, ragged, and outwardly wasting away, he's preaching a stumbling block into foolishness, right? So it's the hardest message to get across, delivered in the worst possible way, and yet the Corinthians believe it. The Corinthians accept it. They have faith. And so the demonstration of the Spirit's power is that they believe. They believe this gospel, not because of human wisdom, not because of eloquence, not because of Paul, but because of God. Paul preached the gospel in such a way that there would be no confusion over who was responsible for the faith of the Corinthian people. It was always God. To him be all the glory, right? And when we think about the end of the previous passage, at the end of chapter 1, Paul says, let the boaster boast in the Lord. And here we see that the way that the gospel was delivered by Paul was that it made no confusion over who saved who. It wasn't Paul. It wasn't his ability. It wasn't wisdom. It wasn't eloquence. It was God's power. May that always be the case as we witness.